Case 623 by Danny Yu. Chapter 6. Earlier. "I can't believe they're making us watch this," one agent said. "If I wanted to watch Stark's Pale Ass, I'd go online." "Yeah, ain't what I thought I signed up for either," the other one replied. "Someone has to make sure it don't go off books, though. Who knows what sex does to a guy after 60 years of abstinence?" The first one snorted. "Turns him into a fucking horse, what it looks like." I glanced at the video feed and opened grimace. My girl doesn't put out like that. How much does a Stark sex tape go for these days? Being shot in the head by one of your superiors, I imagine. Probably gonna go into some high-up pervert spank bank. Don't got no clue how the hell else this qualifies as a mission. He glanced at the screen, returned his compatriot's grimace. Guess he comes like a normal human being after all. The first few times he felt it, the increased shortness of breath, the itching and aching around the arc reactor, Tony mostly ignored it. He was the first person in history to walk around with a fully functioning energy plant in his chest. There were bound to be some unforeseen side effects, likely benign, that he was just going to have to deal with. By November, though, the skin around the reactor was inflamed and irritated, and the itch had turned into a near-constant burn that he couldn't seem to shake no matter how many lotions and salves he slathered on. "It's the palladium," he said to Jarvis. "Isn't it?" With every day that passed, every element or combination of elements they excluded as viable substitutes, Tony felt a vice closing around him. On Christmas morning, as he helped Jamie tear the paper off the presents, it was all he could do to keep a smile on his face and not break down crying. His first Christmas with his son, and it might very well end up being the last. And then what would happen? He worked frantically. Every moment that wasn't taken up with searching for a cure or holding on to Jamie as if he could load a lifetime into a few months, by will alone. He spent scouring the planet for his lost weapons, building prototypes for generators and electronics, enough to keep the company going for a few years at least. And he set up the return of the Stark Expo, not as some huge ego trip, the way Pepper was accusing, but as a way to raise the company's profile, attract enough young engineering talent to stuff the ranks full, give the company a future. He updated his will, made sure it was done properly this time. He knew Rhodey would come home to raise Jamie. He knew he could count on Pepper to run Stark Industries until Jamie was old enough to take over, if that turned out to be what he wanted. He knew that if he had to go, there weren't any better hands to leave this all in. If he had to go, all he could really do was make sure he left his son as bright a legacy as he knew how. Not that he planned on going! So long as there was life, there was hope and all that, but as winter began to turn back into spring, the list of elements they had yet to test was growing depressingly short. "Hey, kiddo," he said, swallowing down the sudden lump in his throat. Jamie was slowly coming awake in front of him, and Tony was still reeling from crossing yet another combination of elements off the list. The ones they were testing now were getting increasingly out there, unrealistic. He took a deep breath, did his best to pull himself together. Kids picked up their parents' emotions according to the books. The last thing he wanted was to make Jamie as frightened or as heartbroken as Tony was. And then those beautiful eyes were opening, and even as premature sorrow stabbed through Tony's chest, the smile somehow came easily to his face. "Sleep well." Jamie grinned wide, 4 tiny pearly teeth peeking out. "Thunder!" he called, taking a moment to clap his hands before he gripped the side of his crib and pulled himself to his feet, chubby little fingers clasped around the handholds Tony had made sure to put into the design. "Thunder!" he repeated, and Tony reached in, lifted him up, and reveled in the small arms wrapping around his neck, the tiny face pressing into the crook of his neck, the feeling of a warm body against his own. Drank it all in, and determinedly didn't think about the fact that chances were he wasn't going to get to see this tiny boy grow up, wasn't going to see how smart and handsome he'd get, wouldn't be there for the first day of school, the graduations, anything. He wasn't going to be there, and he ached at the thought of another small Stark standing in a crowd of people looking for one longed-for face and never finding it. "Love you, kiddo," he muttered, and Jamie straightened up to flash him another grin, hands thumping the back of Tony's neck where he was trying to clap but couldn't reach. He smacked a big slappy kiss to Tony's cheek, and Tony wasn't entirely certain whether that was accidental or not, since Jamie toppled back against his chest in the same moment, but he'd take it. Take anything he could, and give back as much as he was able. If he lived long enough for Jamie to have any memory of him at all, he sure was going to make sure they were happy ones. How about you and me go take a morning dip? Tony asked, managing somehow to keep a smile on his face. One last normal morning before they shipped off to New York and the Stark Expo. It felt oddly like a countdown in the back of his head, the numbers invisible to the naked eye even as he felt them racing downwards. Jamie replied with another "Dada!" and another round of manic hand-clapping, and Tony laughed almost despite himself and kissed the top of baby's head before wrestling him out of his pajamas and dirty diaper and into a pair of swim trunks. Jamie let out a high-pitched noise that sounded mostly like "Boo-boo!" Tony rolled his eyes. Yeah, I know. Food first, lazing in the pool after. He said about mashing up a banana, made himself a chlorophyll smoothie since he was in the kitchen anyway, and plopped Jamie into the high chair before seating himself next to him, bowl of banana goo and a tall glass of unappetizing smoothie, with a straw to make it marginally more palatable, in front of them. He picked up the spoon, scooped up some goo, and held it up in front of Jamie's mouth, waiting for him to open up and eat while sucking in a mouthful of his own meal. Yeah, buddy, laugh it up. You're right, you did get the better end of the breakfast deal. They finished up with a minimum amount of mess, and Tony pulled off his shirt and hoisted Jamie up on his hip and carried him outside. Jamie caught sight of the pool and began squealing and wiggling so hard in his excitement that Tony damn near dropped him. But Tony couldn't help another laugh, grabbed this moment of happiness and held on to it, saved it up for all the ones he wouldn't get. Easy, kid. You've already got the Stark genes. Don't need to be dropped on your head on top of that. He reached the pool, sat down on one of the deck chairs, and got the belt and wings on the kid before jumping into the pool, Jamie squealing like a tiny maniac in his arms. Tony did not like water, not one bit. He had, once upon a time. There was a reason he'd had a pool installed when he'd designed the house, after all, but Afghanistan had kind of taken the fun out of it. Until Jamie turned out to enjoy baths way more than any normal person, grew to love the pool more than banana, and somehow managed to put some of the joy back into it. It was all right, at least, so long as he kept Jamie in his sights and carefully didn't think beyond the moment he was in. Right now, he was in no mood to let the flashbacks get to him. He kept careful hold of Jamie's slippery flanks as the baby splashed and laughed. So happy, Tony's chest hurt even worse than normal just from looking at him, and Tony couldn't help but tickle and blow raspberries on his chubby little tummy, tried to get as many laughs out of him as physically possible. He wasn't sure how long they'd been in the pool when the tapping of Pepper's foot interrupted. Tony glanced up, almost guiltily, met her gaze, but despite the sternness she was trying to exude, he could see a smile tugging on her lips. He grinned back. Morning, Pep. Pep, Pep, Pep! Jamie squealed, waving tiny arms all over the place, accidentally splashing both himself and Tony. He laughed through his face full of water, completely undeterred. Seemingly despite herself, Pepper burst out laughing, and before Tony could quite catch up, she had one of the new Stark phones out and was snapping pictures all over the place. Somewhere out there, someone is going to be willing to pay a fat lot of cash for these, she said, laughter still in her voice for a moment before she reeled herself back in. And it's noon, really, not morning, she said. I'm sorry, Tony, you need to go get dressed now if we want to be on time. Blood toxicity. 24%. For a moment, as Jarvis read the numbers out loud to him, all Tony could do was stare at the drop of blood still sitting there on the tip of his thumb and trying to hold himself together. Everything was falling apart. The palladium was spreading faster than he'd anticipated. The Stark Expo, while he was still proud of that idea, would take him away from Jamie way too much, and now the asshats in the Senate wanted the suit, and Tony had to waste valuable time fighting them, and screw that. He already knew from long experience that once he let go of a weapon, it was out of his hands, and he wouldn't be able to control the damage it would do. The suit was dangerous as hell. He could admit that since he was reasonably sure no politicians had a direct line to his mind. Aside from himself, there was probably only one person he'd entrust with it, which begged the question of what was going to happen to Iron Man once Tony kicked the bucket. No, fuck no. He wasn't going to waste any more time on that shit. Not right now. They'd already delayed him too damn much, kept him away from Jamie for a whole lot longer than he'd wanted, and he had to rely on Pepper's former roommate to babysit again, which he hated. Nice girl and all, but he didn't know her well enough to trust her, and he took a deep breath, forced himself to calm down, glanced over at the playpen in the corner where Jamie was busy sorting geometric shapes into their appropriate slots. It appears Jarvis continued, that the continued use of the Iron Man suit is accelerating your condition. Tony glanced at the scans, winced, began to pull up his shirt even before Jarvis could tell him to. Another core has been depleted. Grimacing, Tony clicked the reactor out of his chest, ejecting the core, and pulled the smoking wreck out. God, they're running out quick, he muttered, felt fear constrict around him for a moment, turned his skin cold, before he managed to suppress the feeling. I have run simulations of every known element, Jarvis said, and by the tone of his voice, Tony could already tell that the results were the same as ever. Inevitability weighed him down. Really, he'd known for months now. The knowledge made him sick to the stomach every time he thought of it too hard. He forced himself not to look at Jamie again, didn't want the baby looking up and catching sight of the look he knew must be on his face. And none can serve as a viable replacement for the palladium. Jarvis finally finished spelling out Tony's death sentence. Tony swallowed down the whole thing, forced himself to focus on the motion of his own hands as he got out another core and clicked it into place. He lifted his shirt up again, reinstalled the reactor. You are running out of both time and options, Jarvis said as if Tony wasn't already aware. Tony did glance over his shoulder now to see Jamie looking at him with big eyes, toys abandoned, and Tony felt his throat click. How much of this shit could an 11-month-old understand anyway? Maybe Tony should stop bringing him to the workshop when he knew the topic would end up being this. He'd been kept away for a day and a half, and God only knew how much time he had left. He didn't want to give any of this up. Unfortunately, Jarvis continued as Tony pushed his shirt back up, took in the slow spread of the black rash, too stunned to stop the AI's next words. The thing that is keeping you alive is also killing you.